Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Rose Provisa, and I am Head of Communities at JW3. JW3 is the only Jewish community centre of its kind in the UK, a vibrant cross-communal hub for Jewish arts, culture, family programming, social action, learning, and much, much more, where absolutely everyone is welcome. We are honoured to be hosting this important community conversation on the Fall of Roe versus Wade. JW3's mission is to increase the quality, variety, and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond, and this evening's event is very much in that spirit. Thank you to all our panel and to everyone watching online for joining us this evening. And a very special thank you to Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg for your support in bringing this event together and for your inspiring BBC Radio 4 thought of the day on this subject. It is now my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Rabbi Zahavit Shalev of North London Synagogue, to come to the screen and to start tonight's conversation. Thank you, Zahavit. I look forward to what comes next.
Thank you. Good evening, Rose. In fact, Rabbi Rose Provisa, a fellow rabbi. It's lovely to have you as community programmer, I think, at JW3. As you said, thanks to you and to my colleague at North London Synagogue, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg as well. We're joined by four very illustrious speakers. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of them. Two of them are American experts and two of them are British human rights experts. And essentially, we're going to have two pairs of conversations where we ask them some provocative questions and then let them loose, let them talk to one another. We invite participation. You can put questions in. There's a spot somewhere on the screen where you can share any questions, and we'll have 15, 20 minutes at the end in which we can put those to our panelists. I think I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. We've got Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. She is scholar in residence at the National Council of Jewish Women, and she's the award-winning author of 8 books on Judaism and feminism, theology, sexuality, justice, parenting, and a bunch of other topics. She's a prolific, I think, tweeter and Instagrammer. I'm the wrong person, but my kids and lots of other people know about you, Danya. And your most recent book on repentance and repair, making amends in an unapologetic world, applies Maimonides' laws of repentance to harm in the contemporary public square, to institutions and to national policy. And that book's coming out in September. Hi, welcome. You're going to be speaking with Ilyse Hogue. Elise is with us for a short time. She's going to be leaving early. I think you guys know each other quite well. It's brilliant that Elise could join us. It was touch and go. Elise is an American progressive activist who served as president of NARAL, Pro-Choice America, a reproductive rights lobbying and advocacy organization, where you were president from 2013 to 2021. In 2020, Elise co-authored a best-selling book, The Lie That Binds, with former NARAL research director Ellie Langford, on the history of the radical right, its authoritarian aims, and its reliance on white supremacy, misogyny, and disinformation. And in September 2021, she became president of Purpose, a social impact organization. And as I said, you will have to duck out early because you have other things to do, but we're thrilled you're here. I'll introduce our other two speakers. We have Elizabeth Prochaska. I hope Elizabeth is with us. Hi there, Elizabeth. Lovely to meet you. Elizabeth is a human rights lawyer with a particular interest in reproductive rights. She founded the NGO Birthrights in 2013 to promote and protect people's rights during pregnancy and childbirth. Elizabeth is currently writing a book about the history of childbirth. And finally, we have Adam Wagner, who is a barrister and another prolific tweeter. Adam specializes in human rights and is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. He's also a visiting professor of law at Goldsmiths University. And his first book, Emergency State on the Constitutional Chaos Caused by the Pandemic, will be out in October. It's brilliant to have everybody here. I've got sort of a broad question for each of the pairs of panelists, and then some slightly more detailed questions. So I'm I'm going to open with Dania and Elise. Your question is like, why should Jews care about the change to reproductive rights in the United States? I'm sure you have brilliant answers to those questions. And even before we embark on that, I'd like one of you, probably Dania, but it could be Elise, to explain just what happened very, very briefly. Very briefly.
Okay, so in 1619, the first enslaved people arrived to America. I mean, like, where do we start? Elise, maybe you want to kick off the what happened, and then I'll fill in. And
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do a very, very truncated version. As Rabbi Shalev said, I wrote a book about the 50-year plan to actually create power for a white fundamentalist Christian minority rule through the weaponization of abortion, specifically, and reproductive oppression more broadly, intertwined with disinformation, court capture, voter suppression, and racism. All of the things that have gotten us here today. And what just happened was what was put into motion quite a long time ago, which is a court that many in our country believe is illegitimate, that was put into place under very suspect circumstances, reversed Roe versus Wade, thereby eradicating the legal right to abortion in the United States. That is the short version. This has been underway for a very long time. And I think what listeners particularly and other countries need to understand is this is shocking and horrifying. And they have been extraordinarily successful at making sure that access is limited to pregnant people who need services to either terminate that pregnancy or actually often cases tend to that pregnancy within the United States, because this is ultimately a fight about control. I'm going to turn it over to Danya to talk about sort of the theology of why Jews should care. I am not a rabbi. I am a historian and an advocate. And I have a much more sort of clinical, pragmatic view of why Jews should care. But the rabbi should really ground us in sort of the spiritual reasons for Jews having a particular interest in this question at this time.
Okay, Danya.
There are multiple reasons. And as Elise indicated, there are a lot of reasons why this happened and how this happened. The overturning of abortion access what has happened since the United States has many different states under one federal government is that now the bottom line is that the country has said, oh, well, each state can decide what's going to happen to abortion. And because of what are known as trigger bans, it's basically al-t'nai, and like bans that said, well, if abortion gets to be our choice, then we're going to outlaw. States have already begun to ban abortion, and more trigger bans are going to come into effect. Ultimately, there will be about 26 states that will have banned abortions, more than half the country. About 40 million people who can get pregnant will be denied abortion care. And that is on white supremacy and patriarchy and all of that. And so a big key, there are several reasons why Jews should care. I kind of want to start with the pragmatic, and then I'll get into the halachic, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who is harmed most by abortion bans? Poor people, people of color, immigrants, young people, trans and non-binary people, people in rural communities, right? When people are denied abortion access, they are more likely to be trapped in poverty and abusive relationships. The national abortion ban will lead to a 21% increase in maternal mortality and a 33% increase in mortality for Black women, right? The number one cause of maternal mortality is homicide, because when pregnancies in abusive relationships, abuse increases, right? So the abortion care for people who are trapped in abusive relationships is extremely important. People are already being denied access to cancer treatments they need because doctors are concerned about the liability if they are pregnant, and chemotherapy, and right? People are being left to die. People with ectopic pregnancies are being left to code on the table. So we have pikuach nefesh, right? Straight up, like the principle of saving lives supersedes everything in Judaism, straight up. And more broadly, even before we get into the halachic question, the Jewish legal question of like, is abortion permitted in Judaism or not? Yes, it is. But even more broadly, we are commanded to build a just society, and abortion bans will do intensify every structural inequality in our country. Okay, this is part of white supremacy, and we need to name that, right? This isn't just, should I get an abortion or write a novel, right? Should I have a baby or write a book? It's not that. This is life or death on a broad scale. So I need to name that before we get into the halachic. And then we get into halachic, we look at the Torah, teaches us, as we start with the Torah in Exodus, says that, I can go through source by source. I actually kind of don't want to. Abortion is permitted in Judaism. We see cases, the Mishnah describes very graphically that if a person is giving birth and they are having trouble, that you're explicitly commanded to save the pregnant person's life, like very graphically, making sure, like taking apart extracting a fetus, in order to save that person's life, because her life comes before the baby's life, unless that baby is half born, unless the head has emerged, because we die with the last breath and we're born with the first breath. And up until then, we are potential life in Judaism. Right?
Dania, I'm going to pause you.
Yeah.
I think we're having abortion, and I'm afraid we kind of lost you a little bit, so we may have to move.
Okay, well, pause me. I'll go off later.
One thing I would say to all the viewers is, if you want to break down the halacha with Rabbi Danya, follow her on Twitter. She does a tremendous job of bringing it to the people. I'll give a very, I think we might have lost our moderator, but I'll give a very quick answer. I always say Dayenu, it should be enough that an injury to one is an injury to all. Dayenu, it should be enough that, maternal outcomes go down, family outcomes go down when people don't have access to the reproductive health care that they need. But Jews should have a very self-interested role in this fight, because ultimately the people who are waging this fight hold ill will towards us. They are, at the end of the day, white supremacists. And that's why you see and that's not everyone who sort of has the ambivalent emotions about abortion, but that is the architects of this strategy who intentionally weaponized abortion. By the way, in 1978, not in 1973 when Roe came down, when most religious fundamentalists in the US really didn't care about abortion at all. But when they decided to weaponize abortion, it was in service of a threat to anything that was not white patriarchal Christianity. And Jews are extremely implicated in that. And when you look at a lot of the rhetoric in the United States around opposition to abortion, it is grounded and steeped in what is called white replacement theory. And for those of you who followed the sort of neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville, certainly it was a threat to Black and brown people in the US. We've seen extremists take up arms against Black and brown people, as they have in the Tree of Life Synagogue and elsewhere. But they marched through the streets saying Jews will not replace us. And the history of this movement that has minority control impulses, authoritarian impulses, is grounded in that white supremacy. And I will tell one last anecdote, and then I'm sure you want to move on. But in 2012, we had a politician, which is more common now, but in 2012, it was really a moment of like, what? Say that people don't need abortion in the case of rape, because if it's a legitimate rape, the body has a whole process of shutting that down, right? This is a piece of medical disinformation that has been disproven, but was perpetrated in service of this end of reproductive oppression, in service of this minority control. When they trace the origins of that particular piece of disinformation, it had traveled from experiments in Auschwitz through a neo-Nazi architecture into the United States radical right-wing movement in the early 70s and began to grow and spread from there. So when I talk about the inextricable links between white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and abortion, particularly in the US context, it's very, very real. In fact, more frequently, we are seeing images of the Moloch pop up on these anti-choice sites, which is, of course, the ancient blood libel, Jews are coming for your children, and that's why Jews actually support abortion. So there is a very, very self-interested reason for Jews to be on the front lines of this fight.
Wow. Elise, you somewhat answered a question which I hadn't even got around to asking, which was, is it really about abortion? And your question was no. You responded, it's a much longer campaign. There's white replacement theory, there's religious fundamentalism, there's a sort of fear, a xenophobia generally, and a bunch of other things that was going on. I think that's really illuminating. I think when we come to talk about the picture in the UK, Adam and Elizabeth, it'll be interesting to see whether you think those same forces are going to be employed if we're traveling in the same direction at all. Maybe it's actually time for you to weigh in now, in fact, and respond to whether that's a unique picture for America or whether, in fact, that's something that we can look forward to in the dystopian future here.
Yeah, sure.
Elizabeth, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's not something we can look forward to. It's already happening. It's been happening in this country for a long time, but people haven't paid it very much attention because the reproductive rights movement in this country doesn't get much attention because people think that the arguments have been won, but they haven't, which is why I set up my organization in 2013. I mean, in very brief outline, abortion in the UK is criminal. It's criminalised under an 1861 statute called the Offences Against the Person Act, which is where we derive a lot of our criminal law around things like assault from. There are lots of crimes under that act. Poisoning, procuring a miscarriage is one of them. So any abortion that you have in the UK is a criminal act unless it falls under the provisions of the Abortion Act 1967, which carves out bits of the Offences Against the Person Act, so that if you have an abortion that's been authorised by two separate medical doctors who confirm that there's a risk to your mental or physical health, then it is a lawful abortion. And it's fair to say it's easy to access that, and it's not hard to access abortion provision in mainland Britain. I can come on to Northern Ireland in a minute, but in mainland Britain, it's not hard to access an abortion. There are plenty of clinics where those forms are rapidly filled in by the two doctors without much interrogation of the woman's actual mental or physical health. But if you have an abortion without medical authorization, you are at risk of prosecution. And in the last 10 years or so, there have been 67 such prosecutions of women. They have received almost no media attention. In the last week, post Roe, you will have seen perhaps some papers reporting some of those cases. There was a young woman, I think she was 15, who was held in a prison cell for 36 hours, having given birth to a stillborn baby. She was, in fact, still, had literally just given birth to a stillborn baby, so she was still bleeding heavily. She was locked in a police cell for 36 hours without treatment or support, on the grounds that the police and social services suspected that she had procured her own abortion after I should have said the 1967 cutoff date is the same as Roe, after 24 weeks. So, there have been multiple prosecutions, cases like that in the UK. So we shouldn't imagine that that things are settled here. They're not. And I think the anti-abortion movement is galvanized in the UK by Dobbs, and will be trying hard to restrict abortion further in the UK.
Wow. I'm kind of blown away by some of this, Elizabeth. Like lots of people, I probably had no idea that was the flimsy way in which abortion is available here is not really much more, not much more robust than Roe v. Wade, which was hanging by a thread.
It's weaker than Roe because there's no statutory or human right to abortion in the UK. It's weaker than Roe. We don't have a constitution, but neither do we have any human rights recognition of the right to abortion in the UK. And the European Court of Human Rights, and Adam can talk about this because it's his area, but the European Court of Human Rights has not recognised any right to abortion in Europe. So we mustn't kid ourselves. We weren't as Roe.
So my bile is absolutely rising because I can't believe that basic human rights, and which specifically mostly pertain to women or people capable of bearing children, seem to be very poorly enshrined in law. And it's not a coincidence. And I want to understand why more robust legal vehicles exist for all kinds of other things. I bet business has like proper safeguards for all kinds of things, but basic stuff about medical health and well-being and fertility and procreation seems to be hanging by a thread, and that's not just in the US as I imagined, but actually in the UK. So Adam, tell us, why is it also rubbish, and is it ever going to be any better that half of our citizens will be better protected by the law?
Well, I mean, just to pick up from where Elizabeth left off, it's funny that a lot of people in the UK have been sort of horrified by what's happened in America. But in fact, the Dobbs position, the position that's now the law in America, which is that the Supreme Court takes that there's no right to abortion arising from the Constitution. There was never explicitly a right to abortion in the Constitution. It was only an implicit right. So Roe versus Wade found an implicit right, and that was the basis of it, which was never a particularly stable basis, but it persisted for as long as it did. That position is exactly the position now, and post Dobbs is exactly the position that is in Europe. So there's no right to an abortion under the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the equivalent of the US Constitution for Europe, but not quite as strong. And the European Court of Human Rights has been asked to find, but has never found that there is any implicit right in the right to privacy or family life. Well, it would come under the right to privacy or maybe inhuman and degrading treatment. The European Court has been asked on numerous occasions to find an overall right to an abortion and never has. The reason being, I mean, and in fact, the parallel is quite strong between the US and Europe. That there are a number of states which are particularly religiously conservative. Spain, the Catholic states in particular, Spain, Poland, Italy, and formerly Ireland, which is now moved forward. And so the European Court has always said, well, states have a margin of appreciation. I mean, exactly almost the language of Alito's judgment in Dobbs, saying, well, we're going to leave it up to states. What the European Court has done in certain circumstances, it said, for example, in Ireland, where there is a right to abortion, you have to give access to it. And the other interesting thing that's happening now is there has been a complete ban recently on abortion in Poland, and I think it was a judgment of the Constitutional Court of Poland that struck down a law allowing abortion. So when I say a complete ban, I mean even in the case where the mother's dying, you're not allowed an abortion. And there's 1,000 cases that have been taken to the European Court of Human Rights, which is looking at them now. And the European Court might well now say, well, we'll recognise a limited right to an abortion, in extreme circumstances, something like that. But all of that is to say, however, it's completely wrong from a European perspective to look at the United States and say, well, they are going backwards compared to us. They have been forwards compared to us for 50 years because of this constitutional right to an abortion, and have now equalised with where Europe is. But having said that, the other part of the parallel is that your right to an abortion will depend on where you live in Europe. So if you live in the United Kingdom, you are subject to the Abortion Act and the position, as Elizabeth said. If you live in Poland, you're in a lot of trouble. But the point is that in each state, the position can change. There's absolutely no security to it at all, I don't think, except for sort of political consensus, which, as we know, can change.
I'd just add to that, Adam, that of course the American right has used the European model to inform their advocacy. They say, look at Europe. Exactly the point you just make. We're no worse than them now. And, Poland gets to make these decisions. Why don't we? So Europe is being used as a model by the American right, which is an interesting inversion, of like what normally happens. We use America as the progressive model, or they use us as the progressive model. But actually now we're playing who can be the most regressive.
Yeah, and I would say as well that we actually talk about Europe, not necessarily the UK, but we talk about Europe as, because our right-wing politicians point and say we should have the European model, right, which is essentially a first trimester access. But we have to recognize in the US that the barriers to access in the first trimester, because we don't have universal health care, because of all the restrictions in the States, because of the clinic closures, are so massive. We're probably crossing messages to some degree. Where we should be looking are places like Argentina, where the movements have been really triumphant in advancing reproductive rights and positioning women as change makers in society.
Elise, I'm going to ask you to continue to talk a bit more about American healthcare. What does fertility, childbirth, childcare, does it all, in what way does it, or does it not sit within the understanding of healthcare as normal people might understand it?
I mean, it wasn't until 2008 that, in the advent of the debate with President Obama around a new healthcare package, that being a woman was not considered a pre-existing condition. And what that means in our insurance system is women were simply charged more for insurance for being women. And outside of Medicaid and Medicare, there was nothing but private insurance. It is important to understand, and this was really relevant to this healthcare reform debate, that if abortion became legal in 1973 in the United States, in 1976, what was passed was called the Hyde Amendment, which stripped low-income women of the right to use what federally subsidized insurance existed to access abortion, thereby putting it out of reach for many folks who would need to be able to use those resources the most in service of accessing abortion. And the reason that that's relevant is because in the debate about Obamacare, the flashpoint became whether or not this package would, in fact, advance access to abortion, particularly for poor women in our country. And that was a debate that actually was not well handled by either the Democrats or the Republicans. This has been a constant challenge in the United States, is because of stigma around abortion. We have seen Democrats cede ground as though we can make common cause with the other side on this, and we will never make common cause. We shouldn't on the backs of the most vulnerable, even if we could, but we cannot make common cause with them for the reasons we discussed previously, which is the opponents ostensibly to any kind of expanded abortion care within the new healthcare package, of which there was almost none, were opponents of the healthcare package entirely. They were just weaponizing abortion in service of that. And so, I think I probably speak for Dania and myself when we bristle all the time when the media or other people will call these movements that are pushing back on these social advances pro-life, because they have absolutely been determined to also be revoking funding from prenatal care, to also being revoking funding from the kind of nutritional assistance that helps people raise healthy families, from parental leave, from childhood education. And so, one of the things that we have tried to impress upon progressive politicians is you've got to call the agenda out for what it is. It's a control agenda. And if we treat it as though we can sort of wedge this issue out, we're not seeing them for what they are. It's morally reprehensible, but it's also strategically a dead end.
Right. And this, this all comes into stark contrast when you see that the same people who are voting to restrict abortion access are also restricting to expand gun access and refusing to make it so that our children can go to school. So you're forcing people to give birth so that they can go to school and hide under a desk or maybe be killed by a school shooter. It's not a pro-life stance.
Dania, I want to ask you another thing. I mean, we're going to need to explore the sort of general constellation of things that people are interested in who are also interested in restricting abortion. But I wanted to briefly ask you, abortion is an acute scenario, but I believe birth control is also endangered. And can you say a little bit about, and Elise, I think you mentioned that medical insurance welfare doesn't entirely sympathize with the fact of being female, and even contraception is endangered. So let's hear a bit about that, Dania.
Okay, so it's all intertwined. The 14th Amendment, which is the right to privacy, was a post-Reconstruction amendment. It was one of the amendments that was put in the Constitution right after slavery was abolished in America. And so when I made the comment sort of at the beginning, talking about 1619, it was flip, but not that very flip. White supremacy is tied up to all of this. And so the right to privacy was connected to the right, it was connected to the agency that Black families that didn't have agency over their bodies originally, suddenly were putting things into the Constitution to name that there are certain rights that everyone should have. When the decision that that abortion is not covered by this right to privacy in the 14th Amendment suddenly opens up this question of what other cases that were covered by, that we had already decided were covered by the 14th Amendment, are now vulnerable. If abortion isn't a 14th Amendment right, then what about Griswold, contraception, which was, this is why we're opening this, Lawrence v. Texas, which is the law that abolished sodomy laws across the United States, right? The decriminalization of functionally gay sex. Nobody was running into straight households and finding out if people were, as they say in the Talmud, turning the tables. It was about gay sex. This opens up marriage equality right there. And also, I think, loving Virginia, interracial marriage, right? There are all sorts of rights about how people live their lives in the most intimate relationships that are suddenly vulnerable. And so that's when people talk about the right to access contraception and what this could mean for people's and for people's lives and safety and future and families. It's terrifying.
And I'll add one comment, and then I unfortunately have to drop because this has been a tremendous conversation. In our Supreme Court in 2016 found, 2015, it all blends together now, found for a company in the US called Hobby Lobby. And the case in question was whether Hobby Lobby had to provide contraception for their employees, as is mandated by our new health insurance law passed by President Obama. What was fascinating about that case is not just that it made it to the Supreme Court, because you had a company that said, I don't want to have to do this because I disbelieve in the idea of having to provide this service. But in fact, that their entire case was grounded in the fact that they were calling certain forms of contraception abortifacients. Abortifacients do not exist as a medical term. It is a piece of medical disinformation that has been perpetuated by the right because they know contraception is really popular and they need to shroud their opposition to contraception and abortion. What the court found, and this was very chilling, and this gives you all a sense of what we're up against, and this is a global fight, it is not a uniquely American one, is the court found that it did not matter that it was factually incorrect that the contraception in question was an abortifacient. It was enough that the litigants believed, the plaintiffs believed it to be true. So when I talk about this fight as being a Trojan horse for a fight for control, it's also a Trojan horse for a fight against, for science against radical religious beliefs, against the Enlightenment and all that we have fought for to have a reason-based society. So on that note, I will say we are the majority, they are the minority. That is our secret weapon, and I will keep fighting with all of you, and I'm grateful for having been able to join you.
Elise, thank you so much. We really appreciated having you. Right. So let's bring in a bit of the religious stuff now. Let's see what happens in the intersection between how Judaism feels about abortion and the law as it currently is tending in America. And Dania, maybe you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. So abortion is permitted in Judaism, and it is required in order to save the life of the pregnant person. And when is it permitted and under what circumstances? And, you know, it depends on who you ask, but you will find post-scheme legal decisors who will say that mental health is equivalent to physical health. And you will say that you only need a very thin reason, and you will see a very, 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 very authoritative post-scheme who will basically, you know, leave the barn door open and say kind of like, if you're going to leave the state, you know, like if you would like to not be pregnant and you would suffer by remaining pregnant, then that is a good enough reason. It's like, gesund, stop asking me, right? And currently, our country has banned abortion. And so that means that times when we would be permitted to do something according to Judaism, we are forbidden to do so by the state. And B, times when we are required, when Rambam, Maimonides, says that it is a mitzvah to have an abortion to save the life of the pregnant person, right? To go after the rodef, as in the classical language. And so when we are commanded by our tradition to have an abortion, the states will still tell us no. And we have evidence that technically in this case, the law says to save the life of the pregnant person, but we know that there are people with ectopic pregnancies who are coding on gurneys. We know that the state's definition of save the life and our definition of save the life are not the same definition. So they are forbidding us from accessing our tradition in times when it would save people's lives. So that is a problem with the free exercise of Judaism. And they have written policy for the law of the land based on when life begins, based on a specific Christian definition of when life begins. And they are imposing it on Jews and atheists and Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and all sorts of people who, according to the Constitution, are not of the United States, are, you know, like, Congress shall make no establishment of a religion. Like, we don't have a national religion in the US, theoretically.
Right.
So that's two different constitutional problems.
I mean, I wanted to just put something out there, which is that, a tension here is that most women would feel, and modern people would generally claim, that this is a woman's right to choose. If you look at some of the literature for the organizations that support maternal rights, they say it's your right to choose, you decide, it's your body, you don't need to listen to anyone else. The Jewish kind of methodology, which you've described, is that, there is a sort of panel of rabbis in the background who have contemplated different scenarios and who have ideas about different scenarios. Nobody currently, I don't know who submits themselves to be adjudicated in this way, but it's kind of interesting that the framework presupposes that there are scenarios which are really clear and that rabbis have decided upon. There might be, in the United States, what's interesting is that some more right-wing Orthodox organizations have aligned themselves with a Christian evangelical kind of tenor when it comes to feeling that there's too much abortion around, and they're kind of in favor of limiting abortion. I find that quite worrying, because that feels like that might be a new idea in Judaism. But I am interested in this idea that, is it about, do we need to invoke our religious beliefs? Do we need to have a panel of rabbis? In Israel, I believe that a woman would have the formality of going before a panel of rabbis, although in fact they normally greenlight every request for an abortion. I don't know if you know more about that, Dania.
There's actually a movement in Israel now to have the panel, to remove the panel, because why would you need to be asking anybody's permission? I feel very passionately that we should not be taking anybody's agency away. That I am glad that we have the receipts in our tradition to make it very clear that this is permitted. And we can go through the source sheet, and I can say, well, look here and here and here, where the rabbis basically say, look, it's permitted, and there is no, therefore come back to me on a case-by-case scenario. Therefore, you have to check in with your local rabbi. It's just like, it seems to me that not only in this specific case, but also, in the case of the adulterous, scenario where the status of the fetus, blah, 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 but also in the legitimate fetus, as long as she's not, actively in labor, if it would cause her woe, right? That's Rabbi Yaakov Emden writing in the 18th century in Germany, like authoritative voice. And it's like, as long as, if it would cause her woe. And he's, he literally opens up the barn door, walks away. I don't think we need to be running around telling people that they need to be submitting to more patriarchal authority. We also have a tradition in Jewish law that says, we know that you don't fast on Yom Kippur when you're sick, right? And ultimately, Jewish law says, well, who knows if you're sick enough to fast or not? And Halacha, Jewish law says the patient knows their own body.
Right? Thank you.
And the tradition says, like, at a certain point, you know your body best, and we have to listen to the people who are most impacted and say, do you know yourself best? Will this abortion save you from woe? Will it be an abrogation of your dignity? Like, kavod habriot is a legitimate halachic category, and other people have ruled that it matters in abortion. Like, great.
I'm gonna ask Elizabeth to weigh in now, actually, because I'm really interested in the history of making your own medical decision when female or when carrying child, because I think that it would be interesting to understand how making those kinds of decisions comes about. Birthrights presumably is designed to protect people at a time when doctors might be deciding for them and they might not be able to make their own decisions. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how that's evolved, how robust or fragile that might be, whether where we're worried. So Elizabeth, say a bit more, please.
Sure. So I suppose what I would say is that you have to see the whole reproductive spectrum. You have to zoom out and look at the whole reproductive spectrum, from contraception right through to labor and delivery and the postnatal period. And abortion is, somewhere on that spectrum, but it's not unique in its issues. Like, the issues that gather around abortion equally affect those other parts of the reproductive spectrum. And I think the focus on abortion, whilst understandable, has meant that we haven't always thought about what happens to people on the whole of that spectrum. So those people who continue their pregnancies, whether they want to or they've been compelled to by lack of access to abortion provision, and what happens to them in birth. If you think about the patriarchy and the misogyny that surrounds the abortion debate, now imagine that pregnant person giving birth, and the same, that you're in the same patriarchal structure. So inevitably, women's decisions about their births are highly constrained, highly restricted. And in the United States, there is a litany of cases, brought against women to compel them to accept medical care, to compel them to have cesarean sections. They are shackled to gurneys and operated on against their will. And that, unfortunately, as with abortion, is not limited to the United States. In the UK, we have had a spate of cases over the last decade where women have been brought to the Court of Protection. Women with pre-existing mental health disorders, be they bipolar or personality disorders or whatever it might be, their capacity to make decisions for themselves is questioned. They are then forced by order of a judge to receive medical treatment, usually a cesarean section, often without any medical indication, without any suggestion that their pregnancy is high risk, purely on the basis that it is the safest course for them to receive the cesarean on the say-so of a single obstetrician, without proper holistic midwifery evidence, without evidence from their family, often without even the woman herself being given a voice in the litigation. And those women sometimes go on to deliver in the way that they want, but very often the court order is imposed and they are operated on against their will. So these things are happening. These things are happening to people day in, day out in Britain and the United States and in other parts of the world too, of course. And we need to recognise that full spectrum of experiences around the female body and what is happening to us. And understand, I suppose, in a historical context, that comes from millennia of attitudes, entrenched attitudes towards women's bodies and suspicion of women. You see it play out. The concept that women are deceitful, that women dissemble, that they might lie, that they might play tricks, especially in pregnancy, that they are hysterical. Those sorts of ideas play out in litigation. You see it in those cases I was describing about mental capacity in the UK. You see doctors telling the judge, we need this order to preemptively order a cesarean section on this woman because she might dissemble, and that word is used, dissemble in labour. We might not be able to trust her. She might not tell us that she is going into labour. And so we need a preemptive order to enable us to carry out this deeply invasive procedure on a woman with mental health condition, which is going to make things even more difficult for her to recover from. And where does that come from? That comes from millennia of suspicion of women and their bodies, from misogyny, from patriarchy. It is built into our structures and our systems in the same way that we see systemic racism built into our structures. And of course, if you are a woman of colour, particularly in the United States, but also here in the UK, if you are a woman of colour, you are that is compounded. That is just in this context, a pregnant person of colour is at the highest risk in this context. So yeah, it's not a pretty picture, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, I think what it underlines is that all kinds of progressive, welfare-y kinds of things are on very shaky ground, and some of the cracks show because they're structurally unsound, or when funding falls, there's just lots to worry about. I mean, what you spoke about, there's also less pain relief that's delivered to people of color. They're assumed to not be believable as witnesses to their own lived experience. All kinds of worrying things that somehow we seem to be becoming more aware of, and they're more concerning. I wanted to bring Adam in and go in a slightly other place. I'm not sure how this conversation will go, but one of the things that I'm kind of intrigued by is the intersection with the way that there's a lot of data being collected, and some also the kind of quantified self movement. Like, should women who are using period trackers on their phones delete their app? Should we be worried that some of the information we're capturing about us is going to be weaponized, that rather than allowing us to kind of own our destiny, actually it's contributing to a sort of police state where we can be further criminalized and condemned? Should we be worried?
Good question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it. I might just take a step back, if you don't mind,
Sure.
and think about this question of autonomy. I think there are two concepts which should underlie human rights protections, and they are autonomy and dignity. And the reality is that although those are very nice sounding words, they don't reflect all of the results that come out of human rights laws in any country, really. I don't think, it's easy to sort of, do like a sort of league table of different countries and say, well, that's a great country for rights and that's a terrible country for rights. But I think a lot of different countries have their own blind spots or just real, bad, deliberate policies that impact on people's autonomy and their dignity. And I think the thing that's really come home to a lot of people, including me, after Dobbs, is you can talk about things being enshrined or protected, or rights being immutable as a word. I don't really like that word because it doesn't. People don't really know what it means, but I guess it means sort of permanent. We talk about that inalienable is an even worse word in human rights law, but that's just not true. It's there's no such thing as rights that are inalienable or permanent, because ultimately, if a society decides it doesn't want those rights anymore for a particular bit of the population or for anybody, it will take them away. That's what history says, and there isn't this kind of just upward curve, ever upward curve that you get a right and that's it. It's kind of locked in. Rights do get taken away all the time, and also and I think there are also backlashes. And I think one of the in a way the backlash against Roe versus Wade has taken decades to coalesce. But you can see that the sort of anger. I mean, like when I read that the majority judgment, there's an anger in there, a real sort of you don't in UK courts yet, but there's a sort of anger at there's sort of an outrage that this has ever been done, and now we're going to righteously take it away because it was always wrong. And I think that can happen to any aspect of our rights, and the way you try and prevent, in a way, the European Convention on Human Rights, the constitutions, and all of those kinds of things they're not a way of solving that problem. They're a realization that the problem exists and an attempt to strengthen and structure rights, they're scaffolding around rights to make it really difficult to undermine them. So you put them into law, you put them into a political constitution, so they're harder to change. You can do all these things in a society to put this scaffolding around them. But doing all of those things is basically politics. There's no magical legal, and I'd say there's definitely no magical religious solution. As in, there's no rabbinical authority will save the day, because rabbinical authorities can be overruled, just like court judgments and constitutions. So I think where I've got to, in a very long way of avoiding answering your questions, because I don't know the answer, is to say that this is all, the answer to all of this is politics and money and campaigning and speaking the problem as well. And if you think of it as it wants a rights taken away, it's some sort of it kind of creates some sort of fundamental change. I don't really agree with that. I think rights can be taken away, rights can be brought back, and this is ultimately just comes down to organizing.
Dania, you're nodding. Do you want to weigh in? Do you want to respond?
Yes, organizing is key. I think when we talk about period trackers, I just want to name that, as far as I've heard, I haven't heard of a single tech company that has promised not to share its data with the government or whoever. So I am like, I have no advice, but that is information. And I think it is politics. And I think we have to remember that it's organizing. And one piece of information about the American context that hasn't been named that I just feel is very important is that the reason the American evangelical right took up abortion is because they lost school segregation. Okay, there's a reason that, I mean, I started with 1619 at some point in the conversation because we were talking about the abrogation of bodily rights, bodily autonomy, right? And forced reproduction starts with the story of enslavement on American soil. And then the right to reproductive freedom and autonomy then the 14th Amendment is the core of Roe was about Reconstruction and liberation from enslavement. And then the evangelicals took up abortion when they lost the battle for school segregation in the 1970s. And they, like, literally the Southern Baptist Church had issued statements saying that that abortion was a matter of personal conscience and the government should stay out of it 4 times before that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these claims to be reverting to religious truth are massively political.
So the fight for abortion justice is about the fight against white supremacy, and it is also about the fight against patriarchy. And we know it is also the fight for bodily autonomy is the fight against transphobia, because we know that these anti-trans bills that we're seeing all over the United States is also, it's interlinked. It's the same Christian nationalist hegemony, right? And we know that the connection between keeping queer families safe and abortion justice is all intertwined. Like, it's all one fight. And so the answer is organizing. And this is all, I believe, it's all backlash. It's all backlash to people getting and gaining rights from the 1950s and 60s and 70s and people pushing, right? So, what we just need to, there are more of us than them, and we just need to organize. We just need to organize and win.
Thank you. I'm sorry about my little visitor. Let's just crack on. Elizabeth or Adam, maybe you want to say something about Europe and about populism and about reverting to more fundamentalist policies. Is that something that's happening here closer to us?
Yeah, so I was just going to pick up on something Dania was saying about the interconnectedness of this stuff. That's totally the same in the UK. So we might think that we have a different environment from the States, but we don't. So there's a solicitor's firm that has been bringing a series of cases on trans rights. Some of our viewers will probably know about the Tavistock and Bell case, about the puberty blockers case, about the, you know about it, Dania. It's been used in American litigation, to try and use the UK precedent in the American litigation, although now the Court of Appeal has reversed the High Court's ruling, so we're in a better place. But that case was brought by a solicitor who is also bringing anti-abortion cases, and he's got a number of them on the go around minors' consent, so children under 18's consent, whether they can really consent to abortions, which was the same argument that was being used in the Tavistock puberty blockers case. He's got a case about a woman who was having an abortion at 23 weeks who sued her abortion provider on the basis that she should have been told that the fetus could feel pain at that stage of gestation. These are all UK cases, and they are, they're the same lawyers working on these cases. So there's a real intersection in the attack, and it's the same as what's going on in the States. So we have to understand that, and that's why I get really enraged and upset by gender critical feminists in the UK, because it seems to me that they haven't understood, or if they have, they are willfully blind to the connections between, these things, to the political movement that is trying to unpick, as Dania said, a legacy of rights from the mid to late 20th century. They are trying to unpick those rights, and the trans rights are absolutely integral to traditional feminist rights around reproduction. They're all part of the same picture. And so the more that British feminists turn on each other and fight about language over feminism and that kind of stuff, the more they are playing into the hands of this movement to undo hard-won rights. So I think it's important for us to understand in the UK, and I'm not sure that is articulated regularly enough in the UK media environment. So,
thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. We're sort of drawing to a close, and I've tried to bring in the questions that have been sort of coming in throughout, and I hope that you felt, people listening and watching at home, I hope you felt that we've acknowledged your input and that we've managed to incorporate it as we've gone along. And because this is all about real lived, real experience and about listening to people when they tell you what's really going on, I might end or kind of, we're not quite there yet, but I might read out a fairly lengthy description that somebody sent in, which is really a statement but not a question, but feels somehow to make it all very personal. This came in quite early. I'm scared that this is only the beginning, as it doesn't seem to stop. Plus, a lot of countries really rely on the USA to make their own rules. If the Supreme Court can lie under oath, repeal Roe v. Wade, and suggest repealing gay marriage, what else can they do? Are they unstoppable? And then it becomes personal. My mother had a lot of miscarriages and some medical abortions in the 7 years before she had me. If she was in the USA with the abortion ban, she would have been either in prison or dead. And the thing is, she wanted those pregnancies. She mourned them. It's a double sentence to those having miscarriages and unviable pregnancies as well. I think this speaks to the really broad experience. I mean, 1 in 3 conceptions doesn't end in a live birth. So lots of people who desire children are living through all kinds of complications along the way. And I was recalling, I had a 12-week scan where no fetal heartbeat was detected. You know, that could have been, I could have been criminalized in another time and place. You know, and I was told that I would have a choice as to whether to have a surgical end to that ended pregnancy or to wait it out. That's a choice that was afforded me, might not be in other times and places. That feels fundamentally disrespectful to our all own lived experience. I wonder if there's anything more that any of you really want to add. Anybody want to say something else as we move towards the end of this fantastical, interesting, wide-ranging discussion? Adam.
I just wanted to add something to Elizabeth's last comment about the UK. I think there's it's possible to overstate the comparison between the UK and the US, as in the UK as a whole is probably more like one of the more liberal states in the US than it is like one of the more religious states. And say you might look at somewhere like Italy or Spain or particularly Poland and compare them to the more, you know, the more religious states. But so because I think that one of the big elephants in the room is the power and presence of religiously conservative communities in particular states. And I think there's a direct correlation in all of these stories about the religious right, and across worldwide that could be the Jewish religious right, the Christian religious right, the Muslim religious right, wherever, you know, depending on the country. But I think that is the elephant in the room, and that's it's really interesting, and it's a conversation for another day. Maybe if I do a Limud session this year, I'll go back to this topic. But there's been a lot of cases brought in the last 20 years or so in the UK by 1 or 2 Christian organisations that have a lot of money to burn, you know, taking employers to court. It's usually things like did a Christian relationship counsellor refuse to counsel a gay couple, people who aren't allowed to wear religious symbols. There's quite a lot of action, as Elizabeth said, over trans rights at the moment as well, and people not wanting to feel they're being forced to, call someone by their appropriate pronouns and those sorts of cases. But I do think the action is on the religious right. That's where it's coming. That's where a huge amount of the political pressure is coming from. And how you deal with that, and of course, religious rights themselves and the right to manifest your religion are protected under human rights law as well, protected under the U.S. Constitution, and that clash between my religion says being gay is an abomination. How am I going to sell a greeting card or a cake with a gay couple on it? Those sorts of things. Those are clashes that are happening in lots of societies, and are being and are the subject of lots of court cases of in lots of different places. And I think that's where ultimately the conflict is going to come, is those sorts of in those issues where there's a conflict between the religious rights or religious beliefs and human rights, anti-discrimination, progressive ideas, and it's not going to. It doesn't seem to be subsiding, despite religion sort of becoming less important to a lot of people in certain societies. So I think it's important to make that point while we're in a Jewish sort of audience, or I imagine a mostly Jewish audience, that is where the tension is coming from. I think on the whole, that's where the money's coming from. That's where the cases are coming from. What the answer to that is, I don't really know. A human rights framework's been actually pretty good at balancing those rights and has been quite good, but will not always do the progressive thing, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Adam. That was helpful. Elizabeth, do you wanna add anything?
I know we just had a question about whether this is all Ruth Bader Ginsburg's fault. I just want to say no, it's not her fault.
Okay.
No, she didn't need to retire early. No, would we ask that of a man? Maybe, I don't know. That's the way the Supreme Court works, and I don't think we should seek to, take down our own progressives.
Mm-hmm.
That was the straw that broke the donkey's back. Her inconveniently dying. You can't blame her for I understand the argument, but it was so delicately poised, the political situation with the Supreme Court, that it was, there was so many things that could go wrong, could lead to this sort of domino effect of having more conservative justices, that the idea that it was just one person's fault, the person who happens to be the sort of the famous liberal judge, is I just think it's placing the emphasis in the wrong place completely. I mean, like what's your answer to that? Is make sure that people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg retire early. That's the answer to the whole problem. I don't think that is the answer to the whole problem.
No. I think that is about the brokenness of American democracy, which is a whole another different conversation about the Supreme Court having a stranglehold over the whole country, I guess. Right. But Dania, you can have a couple of words here if you really want.
Yes.
We need to wind up.
I just want to say the answer is Mitch McConnell for 500, please. And 9 people having disproportionate power, and there should be even proportionate to when they set up how many circuit courts we have, and there should be more justices. But
okay, we're gonna leave that part there. So that was a digression that we didn't need. I think what this really shone a light on was the fragility with which access to abortion is maintained everywhere, frankly, that we have plenty to worry about and a lot of reinforcement work to do to make sure that people have access to basic medical rights that we should all have access to. They're all hanging by a thread. That's slightly more worrying. But it's been a really rich and interesting conversation, and I've learned a huge amount. I hope I've asked the right questions and that people listening in have heard some of the answers and got some of what they came here for today. Plenty to carry on thinking about. We're gonna end now, and we're going to show a slide that mentions some of the organizations that people might want to contact who may be able to carry on fighting the good fight with them. So thank you all. Thanks. Good night. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.